Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
I live in a small town in America's heartland where nothing much ever happens. People go to work and go to church, and everyone pretty much knows everyone else. We all shop at the same stores, send our kids to the same schools. There are picnics at the town square on holidays, and seldom do we have a crime more serious than vagrancy. Some might call our little town quaint, or even dull. But I would argue that point. It's a trade-off. Maybe we don't have the same opportunity for excitement that many places across the country have, but we don't live in fear either. You can leave your car and your house unlocked if you choose, and you don't have to worry about having any of your stuff stolen. You can walk alone down the street in town, not worry about being attacked or even hassled in any significant way. People can let their children play in their yards without watching them every second. Yeah, it's a trade-off. Excitement for safety. But one we feel a pretty fair bargain. Until lately. Though rather insignificant by most crime standards, about 2 weeks ago, people's pets started disappearing. I'm not talking about 2 or 3 pets over that period. I'm talking about several a day. By last count, there had been 26 pets gone missing. Mostly dogs, but a few cats as well. Curiously, most of the pets had disappeared from their owners' backyards, often fenced in with no apparent points of egress. So it wasn't as though these pets were just wandering off or anything. Also, as far as I know, none of the pets that have gone missing have been found. My neighbor across the street, Mr. Braswell, he's lived in the house for about 40 years. Since his wife passed a few years ago, he's been living there alone. Well, him and his German Shepherd. He calls him Soldier. Anyway, Soldier went missing the night before last. I found Mr. Braswell out at his mailbox yesterday morning, and he told me what he'd seen of it. He told me that he'd let Soldier out back in his well-fenced yard just before bedtime, as he always did. The moon was mostly full, so he could see his dog run around the perimeter of the fence towards a back corner. That's when he first saw it, though he couldn't really explain what it was. He said it was like a large, dark mass, just sort of resting along the back fence. Strangely, though, he said it wasn't something he could discern the details of, but it was more like a space where the moonlight just didn't illuminate. He said he could tell Soldier saw it too because he stopped and looked at it, his tails and ears at attention. He thought he heard Soldier growl, and then he'd simply run towards it and disappear inside the black mass, almost like he'd run through a portal. Okay, let me be clear about something. I'm not one to be critical of the elderly, especially of someone who'd served in the military like Mr. Braswell had. But I'd always thought that maybe his faculties weren't what they once were. He was getting on up there in age. I think he was over 90. Still, of all the people who'd lost pets over the last 2 weeks, he was the first person who'd actually claimed to see it happen. That reason alone was enough for me to feel he ought to at least be listened to. He said he'd called the police and they'd come out and taken his statement. Mr. Braswell said he felt like they hadn't really taken him seriously, though. That they just humored him. I didn't know what to make of that. Like I said, he probably wasn't as sharp as he once was, and the officers who'd come out might have thought that as well. But that didn't mean he hadn't seen what he'd seen. That people's pets were disappearing had long since become a serious area of concern for people in my town. But last night, the seriousness and the concern ratcheted up exponentially. A family 2 streets over from mine, the Carsons, had a 9-year-old boy named Tommy and a 2-year-old poodle named Trixie. Just after supper, apparently, as he often did, young Tommy took Trixie on a walk down to the end of their cul-de-sac. Neither one of them made it back home. There were people walking along the route who'd said they'd seen them walking down the sidewalk like normal, nothing seeming the matter. No one had seen anything unusual either, no strange vehicles or loiterers, and obviously no one had seen them abducted. They just vanished, as a cliche goes, without a trace. Clearly, the disappearance of a child had changed things. Fear had come to settle over the community at large. And there was now a visual police presence, something seldom seen or felt in our little town. I'd heard that the mayor had called for the FBI too, but I hadn't seen any evidence of that. Tonight though, as did all my neighbors, I went home and locked my doors. I have a border collie named Jenna, and I've often thought how glad I was she couldn't talk. If she could, she'd probably prove that she was smarter than I was, which would have been really uncomfortable for both of us. But she couldn't talk. So we went along playing the roles of master and pet. The point, though, is that she was a very smart dog, the smartest dog I'd ever been around. It must have been sometime around midnight when Jenna woke me. It had been a while since I'd let her out to go to the bathroom. I stumbled towards the back door, but then I remembered about everything that had been going on. Still, I knew she had to pee, so in spite of the fact that there was a full moon, I grabbed my flashlight and I took it out with us. It didn't take me long to see it, almost exactly as I'd imagined it when Mr. Braswell had described what he'd seen. There was a dark space just to the right of my patio, a space where the light just didn't seem to go. It was larger than I'd imagined, maybe 10 to 15 feet square. I couldn't tell for sure because it wasn't static. It seemed to move, expand, and contract, keeping me from getting a fix on it. I reflexively turned on my flashlight and I shined at the darkness, and the entire thing lit up, like someone had put a lit candle inside a paper bag. I felt fear, but I felt awe as well. Looking at this thing that just didn't appear to be from our world, I was mesmerized. I'd sort of lost track of what was going on, only managing to wonder what this thing could possibly be. Jenna had been sitting on her haunches next to me, but by the time I came back to the moment, she'd stood and walked several places towards the thing. I moved the flashlight's beam to her. She looked back at me over her shoulder and I yelled for her to get away. Jenna! To come back to me. But then she just trotted forward and disappeared into the darkness. I yelled something. I don't remember what, but before I realized what I was doing, I started to run after her. But by the time I'd reached the thing's perimeter, my innate fear had taken hold, and I'd begun trying to stop my forward progress. It was too late, though. I at least partially crossed the thing's edge, and what I saw, it was almost indescribable. There was a vast landscape stretched out before me, a desert landscape beneath a bright, silvery sky, and it felt nothing like being in the real world. Everything was fluid, like it was made from paper or flames maybe, and was being blown and stretched by a stiff wind. Even my own hands and arms appeared distorted in that same way as I looked down at them. It was disorienting. The landscape was mostly devoid of color as well. Everything appeared in varying shades of grays and whites, as though it was being washed out by the brightness of the light. There was a constant noise too, like the rush of water or a steady wind, causing everything to sound and feel fuzzy. I don't know how long I was in that place. A second, a minute, a day. All I know is that I found myself tumbling onto my backside there on the patio. The dark thing still looming over me. I can't say if I'd managed to lurch backwards somehow or if the thing had simply expelled me, but I was out. Jenna, however, was still in. Otherwise, everything seemed eerily calm and quiet. There was no wind, No leaves rustling in the trees. No animal noises at all. No sounds from any of my neighbors' houses. It was like I was all alone. Like that's how the dark thing wanted me. And I could feel adrenaline beginning to pulse through my veins. Probably out of fear, I switched my flashlight back on and shined it at the dark thing. As before, it lit up in a muted peach-colored glow. Also, there came a sound from it. A distant sound that seemed to move closer over time. Soon enough, I could tell what that sound was. It was Jenna. She was barking from somewhere inside that vast landscape, the fiery, colorless desert I'd seen with my own eyes. Somehow existing within this relatively small space in my backyard. I felt a rush of excitement or anxiety or something. No matter, my dog was lost somewhere inside that thing and I wanted her out. I rationalized that it would be foolish for me to go back in because then we'd both be lost, just like the rest of the pets and just like young Tommy. So, instead of venturing in, I called to her, loud as I could, over
Jenna!
And over.
Jenna!
And then I stopped to listen. Sure enough, before long, I heard her reply. She was getting closer too. I could tell from the sound that she was getting closer. Probably from my excitement over her drawing nearer, I managed to move the beam from the dark thing. Naturally, the illumination went away, but so did Jenna's barking. Somehow, I knew right then and there that the light was the key. The beam of light was the portal into and out of the dark space. I hurriedly shone the light back at the thing. It lit back up, and I could once again hear Jenna. I kept calling to her over and over.
Jenna!
She kept replying, sometimes seeming farther away, but sometimes closer. Finally, though, after what seemed like a long time of calling, she sounded like she had to have been right next to the edge of the darkness. Like she was just a few feet away from me. She wouldn't come out, though. She wouldn't cross over and come back into our world. Without giving it too much thought, I found myself moving back towards the darkness. Once I got to the edge, I reached my hand in. How bizarre to see your hand and arm disappear right in front of you. I reached around but could feel nothing. I kept calling to Jenna though, and she kept barking. There came a point, however, when it sounded like she was moving away, so probably out of panic. I forced myself through the dark's outer edge, and I re-entered the fluid, colorless world. To my immense belief, standing right before me was Jenna, her reddish fur seemingly ablaze in the cosmic distortion. I called to her, and she barked a reply, though I could scarcely hear either of us. Over the rushing sounds from this strange world, she ran to me, though. She ran and she leapt towards my chest, and the next thing I knew, the both of us were tumbling on the grass of my backyard. I scooped her up, and I gave her a big hug, and she replied with a multitude of licks across my face. But then, like we'd remembered at the same time, we looked towards the dark thing. It had moved. It was still moving. In fact, towards the back of my yard. I seemed to have lost my flashlight, so I couldn't track it with light, but we watched. It moved down into the wooded gulch behind my fence row, and then it ascended towards the sky and over my neighbor's roof. Eventually, it moved too far away for us to see, its shrinking profile blending into the night sky. We went back inside, Jenna and I was intending to call 911 straight away. I found my phone and started to dial, but something made me hesitate. What was I going to say? That my dog and I had been inside a dark blob that appeared in my backyard? That it was actually a portal to another universe? And I'd somehow managed to save my dog from it? Was that my story? It took me about 2 seconds to decide. Of course, it was my story. It's what had happened. My guess was that this dark thing had been lurking around our town for the last several weeks, and it was responsible for all the disappearances. Would people think I was crazy or that I was just trying to get attention? Sure, some would, but some wouldn't. The way I figured it, if people knew what to look for, they'd be more likely to find it, or for some, to avoid it. Either way, from my perspective, it was imperative that the thing be found. I'm an animal lover, so that several dozen pets had disappeared these last few weeks would be enough reason for me, just as it would for a lot of my fellow townspeople. But there was a higher calling here. Tommy Carson was in that thing, or place, or whatever it was. I knew it in my bones. And if I could make it back with Jenna, Tommy Carson could be found and brought back as well. Jenna was standing next to my chair, looking at me expectantly. I gave her a head, a quick rub, feeling immensely grateful that she was with me, that she was as smart as she was, and then pressed the send button on my phone.
911, what's your emergency?
Chilling tales for dark nights.